going to try and be as short and to the point as I can during this video. I have a lot of videos about my experience that are already up on my TikTok channel, which is the first social network where I just decided to speak out about this because I know I don't have a lot of believing family members and friends that use that platform. My number one thing, the first thing that tipped me off to the fact that there was something really wrong was my experience going through the temple for the first time. I was fully prepared. I did the classes. I had been a member for 22 years at that point. I was getting married. I was just so ready. And when I went through, I very, very quickly realized within the first few minutes that I had absolutely been lied to about what was going to happen. I had been told that it was going to be like sacrament meeting. You'd make a few promises with God, but like no biggie. There's nothing that you're going to be surprised about. There are promises that you would have kept anyways, like no big deal, okay? And that it was going to be like sacrament meeting, but we'd all be wearing white. I thought I would be wearing a white dress. Turns out we're wearing white dresses with some poorly designed Adam and Eve cosplay outfits on top of that no one warned me about, that I had to pay to rent, right? Keep in mind that these ceremonies in the Mormon church are obligatory if you want to not be separated eternally from your family. So it's a big deal. And the fact that you have to pay 10% of your income to even be worthy to go in, and then on top of that they make you pay for the clothes, they make you pay to rent them. I understand if you're buying a set of clothes to take with you all the time, but paying to rent the clothes felt very wrong to me. The cha-ching of the cash register as I'm going into the temple was very upsetting. I had read the New Testament a lot before going through because I thought I was going to be learning about Jesus, and so I thought to myself, well, I'll just read the New Testament a lot and then that'll help me be better prepared. No, because a lot of the stuff that happens in the temple, like they want you to kind of ignore what Jesus said in the New Testament to make it work. I was absolutely horrified by the promises. Some of them were fine, like to be faithful to your spouse. I was expecting that. There was also a promise where you have to listen to your spouse, and your spouse, the men get to promise to listen to God, and women have to promise to hearken unto or listen to their husbands. So your husband is the first communicator with God, and you as a woman are kind of, down on the ladder. He gets connection with God first. And I was like, that's weird. And the big one for me was they asked us to promise to covenant with God that we would give everything we had, money, time, talents, even your life if necessary, to the church, not to God, to the organization. And I was very upset by that. I thought that was very manipulative. I thought it was incredibly manipulative that I hadn't been warned about any of this or told that I would be making those specific promises. They tell you that these are the most important promises you're going to make in your entire life. It's this huge deal. You need to make these promises in order to be able to be saved in the afterlife and be with your family forever. But they don't tell you what any of these promises are going to be beforehand. And that was a lot for me. But I was very much under the impression that if I wasn't loving everything that was happening in the temple, then that meant there was something wrong with me, because that is what I've been taught my whole life, that this was the ultimate goalpost. Everyone was so excited to go to the temple. It was the most beautiful place on earth. And I felt the whole time that I was in there, the entire ceremony was being led by Satan. At the time, I was a very religious person, and I remember praying in the temple and feeling like, this is not of God. You need to leave. This is bad. This is not God's home. This is not what you've been taught. You need to leave. I had a panic attack. I was sobbing. At one point, I was like, I just want to leave. And I was told to be quiet and obey. That was fun. Be quiet and obey. And the person said it in the creepiest voice possible. And at this point, I'm like, what's going to happen next? That was my biggest anticipation because I didn't know what was going to be happening. I was having a panic attack because I had no idea where this was going. I didn't know that we were going to be learning secret handshakes to be able to get into heaven, that we would need to be able to, present to the angels when we get to heaven's gate. I wasn't warned about any of that. At one point, I was like, are they going to sacrifice an animal? Are they going to sacrifice a virgin? Oh God, please don't let anyone know I'm still a virgin. I was freaking out. I had no idea where this was going. It was just overwhelmingly an anxiety-inducing experience for me. I don't think that it's morally sound that their members are not warned step by step of what will happen in the temple and exactly what they're going to be promising. I don't think there's any morally sound reason that you wouldn't let people know what they'll be promising word for word before they go through. But again, I was operating under the idea that if I don't love this, it's because I'm misunderstanding something. It's because there's something wrong with me, because that's what I'd been taught my whole life. So for the next few years, I operated under the fact that I had had this very overwhelming, destabilizing experience. I went back to the temple because everyone that I talked to was like, you just need to go back. If you go back enough times, you'll eventually become desensitized to it and you won't feel bad while you're in there anymore. And I remember thinking, if this is God's home and this is like the most loving, wonderful place on earth, why would you have to become desensitized to it? I talked to probably 40 plus members privately, still as somebody who's believing and very much in the search of finding out the truth about the church, and like very much thinking, oh, I just need that confirmation that this is a true church. I know it's the true church. It's God's one true church on earth, but I really need help with my testimony. And every time I would talk to these members privately about the temple, I was either kind of disappointed because they would just brush it off and sweep it under the rug and be like, oh, you don't need to think about it. Just don't think about it too much. Or they would secretly have been as traumatized as I was going through, but also under the impression that they were wrong. I didn't talk to anybody from my generation, like the millennial age group, that went through and was like, that was so beautiful. I was just touched the first time. And yeah, like, here, let me explain this and this to you, and then you'll feel better going through. So many other people that were still active members and going regularly had also been traumatized and felt like they'd been lied to or misled before going to the temple. And for me, that was a huge red flag. So I thought, you know what? This is God's true church. I'm going to look into church history and figure out more about the temple ceremony. And that is going to make me a stronger member. I didn't dig very deep into the church's website and church history before I was very well made aware that it was clearly based on a fraud. That the whole thing was based on Joseph Smith lying basically so he could sleep with other women and make money. I know that's gonna be shocking to anybody if you're a member and listening. I was in such denial for like 3 years. I was studying deeply, reading my scriptures for like an hour every single day, really deep diving. And the more I was reading these scriptures, but now with the perspective of something might be off here, the more I was seeing the inconsistencies and the problems, like how in the beginning of the Book of Mormon, one of the first stories that God decided to put in the Book of Mormon, if it was God, was the story of Nephi, who is a thief, a liar, and a murderer. And he is the hero because he steals, he lies, and he kills in the name of God. And that is a good thing. And I was so disturbed by that. At this point, I've only looked at the surface level history that is on the church's website. And I was quickly realizing that a lot of the things growing up that I had been told were anti-Mormon lies were actually admitted to by the church on the church website, can be found in the Joseph Smith papers and other church-approved resources, but that the church was intentionally not teaching this in their manuals or sharing it with everybody. My personal last straw was when I was living in France, and I decided, you know, I don't like a lot of the stuff. I don't know if I believe in Joseph Smith anymore. I don't know if I believe in the Book of Mormon, but I love the stories of Jesus helping people that can still be inspiring. I can still pull some good out of that. And I brought a notebook with me and I said, every time that there's a lesson about Jesus, I'm going to take notes about it for the next 6 months and see how that makes me feel about the church as a whole. For the next 6 months, there was not a single lesson, not one lesson on Jesus. Jesus was only mentioned superficially, like at the end of prayers or just like quickly passing in a lesson, but there were no lessons about Jesus or his teachings. It was all about missionary work and tithing during sacrament meeting. Those were the two themes. So get more members and get more money. Those were the two overlying arches, the themes that kept coming back every single week. I think this, I don't know if it's just our ward or this whole stake was doing it, but they were really doing a big push for tithing and missionary work. I was just so disappointed. And my empty notebook, because we had not had a single lesson about the life or teachings of Christ within those 6 months, I was like, I can't do this. I'm going to step back and take a break. I did take a break with the intention of probably coming back. I thought I just need some space for now so I can figure things out, get things clear in my head, and I'll probably end up coming back. And that's when I dove deeper into church history. During this time, I continued to read the Book of Mormon, read the Bible, and look into church history sources, trying to better understand the temple so I could strengthen my testimony. And the more I found about church history, the more disgusted I was and the more upset I was, because clearly I had been deceived by the church. I had been lied to. My two big issues were polygamy, especially Joseph Smith's polygamy, because we're always presented that he had this beautiful love story with his first wife, Emma, and told that like, oh, polygamy happened, but it was only when it was absolutely necessary. These poor girls, these poor women had no other options. They wouldn't have been able to own land without being married. they were like widows, and they make it sound like it was something that only happened because it was strictly necessary, which is not true at all. Joseph Smith was marrying mother-daughter pairs, he was marrying sisters, he was marrying girls as young as 14, threatening some of these women and their families eternal salvation if they didn't marry him. It was wild. Some of the girls, he told, an angel with a sword would come and basically unalive him if he didn't marry them. There were a few girls who turned him down, and he publicly degraded them, called them whores at the pulpit in front of other members, tried to destroy their reputation. One of the girls, he tried to make people believe she was a prostitute because she didn't want to marry him. These women had no choice. Lucy Walker, who was one of his 14-year-old brides, viewed herself as a human sacrifice. According to her diary, she did not want to be marrying this man. She felt it was wrong, but he was the prophet, so what choice did she have? There's nothing sacred about it. It was clearly men that were trying to get women for power and political reasons and sex. And then the second big issue, and this for me was the final nail in the coffin. This was there is no justifying this. You cannot go back on this. This is proof that the whole thing is made up. Was the Book of Abraham. If you go on the church's website, there is a gospel topics doctrine essay about the Book of Abraham. And basically, Joseph Smith, he told everyone he translated these different books, right? The Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, which is like the Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham. The only one of these books that we have, like the original documents that he translated from, is the Book of Abraham. And the church was so excited. I think it was back in the 70s or the 80s when we could finally translate Egyptian hieroglyphs. They went and had it professionally translated, thinking that this was going to prove that Joseph Smith had the power of God to help him translate these books, and it ended up proving the opposite. The original papyrus rolls that we have nothing to do with the Book of Abraham. They were not written by Abraham. They were not written by anyone anywhere near his time period. The dating's completely off. They aren't even stories. It's funerary text, just like a common funerary text of the time. Joseph Smith told people that he translated that it was Abraham that had written on this papyrus, and it was all a lie. He had completely lied about the translation of the Book of Abraham. So why on earth would I trust him for anything else? And then the more you dig, you become quickly aware that there's just this overwhelming hill of evidence that the church was based on a fraud, and it becomes quite upsetting the more you dig, because you realize how deep the lies went. And you also quickly realize that the people who are in the top positions of leadership, like the top 12, they're aware. They know that they're not telling the full narrative of the church's history to members, and they're also aware that if members know about it, they're likely to leave. I will say something: if you are a member and you've gotten to this point, I am not interested in arguing with you in the comments. If you try to argue, I'm just gonna block you. I'm not interested in this. If you would like to argue, there are a lot of ex-Mormon TikTok accounts where you can start up a lively debate, and it'll be easier to argue with you in that context because we can make response videos and such. But overall, something that really surprised me when leaving the church, and that I never expected, because our church is big on free agency, they're big on everyone should pray to know for themselves. So when I prayed and I got the answer every single day for 3 years that it was not true, that it was not God's one true church, and I decided that for me, I needed to step away because I felt so deeply in my heart that this was not any sort of true church whatsoever. I was surprised at how nasty people were, especially since upon leaving, I spent probably the first 5 years trying to be the perfect ex-Mormon. The prophets and the apostles, they like to badmouth people who leave the church from the pulpit, and they'll tell you they're lazy learners. They'll tell you that these people are lax disciples. So basically, they have this whole narrative that people leave because they're offended. They leave because they're not strong enough. They're not strong like you, the ones who are staying, and that they just like were too lazy to be able to keep up the standards of the church. They use the standards talk a lot to try and put themselves in a position of hierarchy over people who leave. I personally left because I didn't find God's standards in the Mormon church were high enough for me. A God that would tell a man that he needs to be marrying 14-year-old children behind his wife's back, because that's the other part of that equation with polygamy. Joseph Smith didn't tell his wife Emma about most of his wives. She only knew about 5 to 8 are the current estimates, and he was married to 30 to 40 women, depending on which sources you look at. If you are a member, please be nice to people who leave. I was shocked at how nasty people were. And again, I was being the perfect ex-Mormon. I never showed my shoulders. I wouldn't drink coffee. I tried to still follow all of the church rules to show that I didn't leave just to sin. It was really important to me to be a good example of an ex-Mormon because of how badly they crap on people who leave the church. I realized after about 5 years of people just being awful to me, despite the fact that I was super respectful. I never said anything bad about the church. I was super polite about the church. I kept everything to myself. I didn't ever bring it up into interactions. I was really like very modest and very polite and everything about it. People were gonna be nasty to me, whether I kept quiet or whether I said something. Whether I wore a tank top or not, these people had a narrative in their mind and they were determined to force me to fit into this narrative, because I think it's hard for a lot of members to admit that a lot of people are leaving because they just don't believe it's true anymore, that they have found things within the church's history that are below their moral standards, and so they don't want to stay in the church. I think that's a really hard pill for members to swallow, and it's a lot easier, especially when you've dedicated your entire life to this high demand religion. It's a lot easier to demonize people that left rather than humanizing them and listening to their stories. And the church knows that as well. That's why they demonize people from the pulpit, because if you stopped and actually listened to people's stories, it would be almost impossible to stay. That is something I've noticed. There's a couple of people, members that I followed on social media over the years that were members, but very nuanced members, and they were very determined to like make the church better from within, and they just had this, yeah, like, I know there's problems in church history, but here's how we can work it out. And they were so determined to make it work, and so positive and super nice to people who left the church, super nice to members that are more orthodox that have stayed in. And so far, all but one of those people that I've followed have left the church, because it is very hard to stay in when you actually start looking at the reality of what's going on and you start humanizing the people that the church demonizes. It's really hard to listen to their stories and not realize that something is off. All right, I love you guys very much. I'm very excited to see you in another video, and we'll chat soon. Ciao.